Hello, hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to another episode of Teach Jenn Tech, or as homie updated the graphic, Teach Jenn Prisma, which I'm excited for all of those who have joined in on the journey of the TweetyTag app. I think that's what we decided it was called. Nikolas is here joining us today from Prisma. And Nikolas, please introduce yourself and what the flow of today is going to be.
All right. Yeah, very happy to do that. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Jen. I'm really looking forward to this. We've talked a little bit before the stream already, and I think we're just in the perfect position to really get a lot out of the stream together. My name is Nikolas. I work at Prisma. We are a startup that is focused on building database tools. So we kind of just want to make it easier for developers to work with databases. And like over there, I lead the developer advocacy team. We have 4 developer advocates on the team currently that I'm managing. And I've been actually around at this company for almost 6 years now. So I started when we were only 5 people. We were still called GraphCool back at that time. Actually, we were in like kind of another company with another product. And then we kind of pivoted over time. Everything evolved. And now we're called Prisma and are focusing on the database layer of developers' applications.
I dig that. And y'all, in case you were curious, like I ended up using Prisma because Anthony said so. This is my answer to a lot of stuff is Anthony told me to do it. Anthony said so.
Straight from the horse's mouth.
Right. So he does know that half the time. Those are like the 2 things I say all the time is Ben D. Myers always says things about accessibility. So I'm always like, what would Ben do? And then because of like making sure I have my alt text and stuff. And then Anthony made me do it is the other thing I say on repeat. So, and what up, Ryan and Anthony? Yay, you're joining us as I'm talking about you.
All right. It's so fun to be on StreamYard only as a guest. When we use it to stream What's New in Prisma every 3 weeks, I'm in there as an admin, and I can also move everything around, highlight comments and all that. And here for the first time, I see what Prisma, what StreamYard looks like as a guest. That's fun. And
here,
hey, Anthony.
We can put that one up. There we go. Anthony says you're a StreamYard pro.
Some experience under my belt here.
I'm hoping that later this week, I'm going to be starting to use OBS and Ping instead. So we'll see. I'm getting there.
Yeah, actually, we thought about evaluating Ping as well. Haven't started really looking into that, but it's floating around in our team, and I think at some point we'll also see if and maybe serves our requirements better than StreamYard.
I will say it is pretty cool in being able to do like chat overlays and things with OBS, and then the easeability of going, because I use it for D&D as well. I play D&D on Friday nights, and the host has a Ping account, and it's really easy to get in, kind of like StreamYard. So from that aspect, I like it.
Nice. All right, Jen, should we talk a little bit about what we have planned for the stream today?
Yes.
All right.
I'm also not multitasking very well and making sure that I am putting that we are live on all the things so people know to come hang out with us. But I try to have it like where I just have to hit enter, and then when I don't, it's this. It is me not being able to multitask. But this, I think, is the fun thing about streaming live is I don't have to fake it. I'm literally, this is who I am. So this is what everybody gets. And what up, homie? And thank you, Anthony and Ryan. I am working on it. I have like 3 new lights and lights behind me now. I'm going to figure it out eventually. It's going to happen. But yes, please talk to us about Prisma.
Yeah, so for the stream today, I think on a high level, we'll do 2 things. So first of all, I want to give you a thorough introduction to Prisma so that you really understand like what it is, why it's useful, how it fits into the stack, and familiarize yourself with the three main Prisma workflows. That's data modeling, that's migrations, and that's querying. And we'll talk about all of these in more detail. So again, we'll build up the context slowly for all of that. And then I think in the second part, once we've gained that that basic understanding, we can move on and look at the TweetyTag app and figure out together if we can make it work. I am also not a Next.js expert. I'm not a front-end developer expert, front-end development expert in general. My background actually is in mobile development. That's what I did before I joined GraphCool, or like Prisma, how we are now called. So the last 6 years, I was able to transition into the JavaScript ecosystem, which, by the way, compared to at least the Apple developer ecosystem with iOS, like JavaScript and Node.js, just a hot mess with all the different options and versions and browsers and libraries. That's a lot like more. Or you have a lot more paved paths inside of the Apple developer ecosystem.
We have talked about, just so that way you know too, we've talked a little bit about Android development and with Zachary Powell, and what we're might do someday, might is once I get TweetyTag to work, is we actually make it into an Android app and work with him on how to make it into an Android app to do it.
Nice.
So
very cool.
It's ever evolving. But yes, where would you like to start?
Let's start on the Prisma landing page, and maybe you can already go ahead and share your screen. I was quickly thinking whether I should do that, but I think maybe since I'll walk you also through the main Prisma workflows, we can just start by sharing your screen. And
I like how it's just like, if I type Prisma, it just knows to go to connect your database, which is where I was at the entire time. So let me make sure I go to the home page.
Yeah, it's just prisma.io. Exactly. And if you scroll down, there is one section that I want to highlight here to get started, and that's how does Prisma fit in your stack? That's where I want to start. A little bit further down, a little bit further down. This is Prisma Client. I think there's Prisma Studio and Prisma Migrate. Yes, a bit further down.
Oh, there we go.
It is. How does Prisma fit in your stack? So, Jen, have you seen such an architecture diagram already with a client and a server and database?
Not specifically this way. The way I've seen it has been more of in a GoDaddy context of when I worked in hosting there, where we would work with MySQL and we would have to help people with their hosting servers. And so not exactly, but kind of.
All right. So let me untangle this then a little bit and explain the context for why I want to start with this diagram to explain what Prisma is and like where it fits into one stack. So these three components here are typically also called the three-tier architecture. And that's like pretty much the standard way how to build web applications these days. Three-tier because we have these three main components. We have the client, we have the server, and the database. And the terms for this are somewhat ambiguous sometimes. So a client sometimes is also called the front end. You could call the server and the database together the back end. Sometimes people call only the server the back end. Sometimes they call the server the API. So the terminology is a little bit ambiguous, but these three components, I think in general, are just like very good as a mental model for how to think about a web application. And if we start at the front end, you, I think, in previous streams, for example, have built React applications, right? And you also just talked about a mobile application. So on the front end, that's exactly the kinds of applications that are being built there. It's mobile applications and it's web applications that are running in the browser that might be built with React, with Angular, with Vue, with Svelte. All of these like UI, JavaScript frameworks, they give you a way how to build JavaScript applications that are running on the front end on the client. The main purpose of these client applications is to render a user interface to the users so that they can interact with the application. So it's usually very heavy in terms of building user interactions, building a user interface, building views, and then because views just by themselves would be pretty useless, most of the time these applications also need some data, right?
Right.
Inside of the application, if we are talking about an application like Twitter, then if I'm on the feed, I need to fetch the data that is the input for my feed. Or if I click on somebody's profile, I need to render the information for that particular person. If we didn't have this aspect of the data that we're pulling into the front end, into the client, then we would really only have like a skeleton of our view without anything to really look at. So that's the client, and it needs data. Where does it get the data from? Well, if we look at the right side of this diagram, we see the database. And that's where the data is being stored, where it's persisted, where it's going to just stay over time. And it's just, that's the place where the data lives, where it exists in the physical world, so to say. But these client applications, so you could now say that, okay, that's convenient. I already know how to build kind of like a client application with views, but I need data. So I have my database on the other side. So why doesn't my front end just fetch the data from the database directly? And that's actually a really valid question, I think, that a lot of people might ask. Have you had this question yourself in the past, or do you have any thoughts about this?
Again, I'm horrible at multitasking, and I feel like I'm really, really happy that Ramon and Anthony are here today. Because if I remember correctly, Ramon and I was looking for the link because I'm pretty sure it was this. Yes. Ramon and I built an Express API.
Yeah.
And I think that's like literally the most like direct way that I've ever done it. Like I might have done some of it when I did the yes, we did. Ramon, we connected it with Mongo.
Okay, yes.
So I was like, I'm pretty sure I've done this kind of a very long time ago. Feels a long time ago now, but
all right. But yeah, that's the client and the database. So why do we need this server in the middle, this like middleman? There are multiple reasons to that. Maybe if you were to redesign the web from the ground up, maybe you would come up with a way how the client could interact with the database directly. But the way how the web the web is built today and the infrastructure it runs on, it just makes sense to put the server in between for several reasons. One reason is that most databases, if we're talking about the most mature and popular ones like Postgres, like MySQL, like MongoDB, they don't work with the like most popular protocol that we're using on the web, and that's HTTP. You connect to them with another protocol that's on a lower level, TCP, and that's just one incompatibility of why a client who typically sends HTTP requests can't really talk to a database directly, because the database only understands TCP. So that's one reason the client wants to talk HTTP, but the database only accepts TCP, so the client cannot directly talk to the database. That's one reason why we put the server in between. Another reason is that we need some business logic for our app. And with business logic, I mean such features already as user authentication. If we want to be able to provide a way for a user to log into our application with a username, with an email, and a password, that's something that we cannot implement in the database, because we actually need to write code. We need to do more than just store data inside of a data store. We actually have to implement some code, some logic, and that's not possible in the database. Maybe there would be ways, things like stored procedures, but I don't even want to get into that because it's just not the way how we want to build modern applications. So yeah, the business logic, things like authentication, or if you need to implement a payment process, or if you need to communicate with external services, all of these things, they count as business logic, and you would implement them on the server side. So now we have an understanding of these three components. We have an understanding of the client. That's where we have the UI, JavaScript frameworks. Then we have the database, Postgres, MySQL, Mongo to store the data. And in the middle, this middleman, the API server that somehow mediates between the two. Yeah.
Okay, first off, like, I think that's a first time. And y'all, especially with Ramon and Anthony here, I feel like I need to say this caveat. Y'all might have told me this, but it didn't click. At least now it kind of makes sense of why it needs to be the server in the middle and why my front end couldn't connect to the back end of the translation of the two protocols. I will say, I'm just putting this out in the world. If anybody knows someone that wants to come on the show and just talk protocols and teach us about all of the protocols, because there's so many out there and what we all use them for, please send them my way. But thank you, Nicholas, for at least this is making sense right now.
That's great. Yeah, so let's zoom a little bit into the API server and the different kinds of things that it's typically also responsible for. So like when you build a front-end app, for example, with React, what kind of app did you actually build, Jen? And where did you get the data from back then?
Run that by me one more time.
When you build a React app here on the stream or like some other app where you built a front end, where did these get their data from?
For the React one, it was just like Googling build React app. And that was it. It just was the front end of it.
Okay.
And then when we did when I did the one with Ramon on Express, I'm pretty sure we just put in data to query it and just that was it. It wasn't like actually on the Express one, we were putting in things people say to us that are nice.
Okay.
Like, good, like if you have a bad day, let's make an API that will call goodness that people have said to you.
Yes. Okay. And you stored that manually inside of the MongoDB database, which you were using then, and then you were putting an API on top of that.
And please know, this was stream number 3. So we're talking about stream number 2 and 3. And the only one I had before that is, do I know the difference between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? And back then, no, I did not. So this was all new to me at that point. But yes, we did definitely, if I remember correctly. And then this is a question from Homie of if they become proficient using Prisma, will they have to write very little SQL, if at all?
That's a really good question. And I think this is already a good statement as well. They indeed will have to write very little SQL because what Prisma does, it abstracts the SQL away. Usually when you are working as a backend developer, so the person implementing the server here, again, your job is to mediate between the client and the database. So what that means is that the client will send you requests, typically HTTP requests, via REST API, such as the one that you have built with Express, Jen, or a GraphQL API that's in principle very similar to a REST API. It also delivers data. It also allows you to invoke operations on the back end, but it's just a little bit more developer friendly, I would say, if you work with a GraphQL API. But in principle, they have the same responsibilities, and that's to deliver data to the client. So as a backend developer, as a server-side developer, what I need to do is I need to somehow process incoming requests, and I have to then write code that understands what exactly is being requested. It creates a corresponding database query, reads that data from the database, packages the data that I just received from the database as a response up in a structure that's expected by the client and send it back to the client. Maybe we take an example, the example about the Twitter profile which I've mentioned before. So assume that you're opening the Twitter application in your web browser and you're navigating to someone's profile. What then happens is that the Twitter app on the front end, it sends an HTTP request to the server. And in that HTTP request, it includes information about who is the user that you're requesting the profile from.
Let's hope my messages aren't up, just so that way I can go through these at the same time. And we'll go look at your profile.
All right.
Yeah.
If you actually open the console here, it might be interesting to look at this and see the network requests that are being sent. If you click on the arrows there, so like you're now in the console view. I meant the network request tab. Sorry, inside of the developer tools there. Yeah, network. And let's see. I haven't tried this myself before. If you select the box for fetch/XHR first, because that will only show us the HTTP requests. It's on top. Yes, this. And now, if you refresh the page, let's see if there is some kind of. Okay, this looks way too complicated. I don't really know how to parse this right now. But just in principle, what happens is that, and it's like vastly simplified, the scenario I'm opening up here. Obviously, when you actually use twitter.com, it's much more complicated what's happening under the hood. But in principle, what happens is that the front end, it needs the data that you see here on my profile. It needs my name, it needs my Twitter handle, it needs my bio, and all of that. It requests from the server by sending this HTTP request to the Twitter API, and includes probably my my user ID or my user handle, some way to uniquely identify me as a user. So then the backend developers at Twitter, they certainly have gone through that process. Oh, there you go.
Make it giant.
Yeah. The backend developers at Twitter, they have implemented logic to then receive such a request from the front end and extract my username or my user ID, my handle from that request, and use that as a variable inside of a database query that there's then sending off to the database. The database responds with the data of my profile, and the backend developer again writes code to package the data that they just received from the database, package it into the structure that's expected on the front end, and then return it to the front end. So this kind of journey of the data traveling from the front end as a request to the server, then to the database, and back through the server to the client, I think is like really important to understand kind of where Prisma fits into that.
And he got us an example while you were explaining too.
Yes. So here we are in the network tab again for this URL, and there we specifically see what kind of HTTP request has been sent. So all of this, what you see there on the right side in the general and response header sections, are part of the HTTP request that has been sent through your browser in this particular situation.
Nice. Okay. Thanks, Anthony, as well.
Yes, that's it's always so good to have people on the stream who think along and who don't let you down when you're stuck and you have to debug something.
Oh, it's been fun. We've gotten stuck on having to debug stuff in like so many different streams. It's a lot of fun. I feel encouraged that it's not just me.
All right, so that's how I wanted to start, just with this kind of basic understanding of these three components and how the data flows in between them, and where Prisma is relevant. Because as a front-end developer, if you're building a React app, and I'm not talking about Next.js at this moment or anything where you can also execute server-side code from a front-end framework, but just a React app or a Vue app, which is just an app that's running inside the browser. as a front-end developer who's building an app like this, you will not get in touch with Prisma directly. Because Prisma really only happens on the backend or is used on the backend because it needs to interact with a database, and this database interaction is implemented on the server side. So again, as a front-end developer, you're not interacting with Prisma directly, but you're always just like sending HTTP requests to some kind of API that will serve you the data that you need for your application. So if it's not for front-end developers, okay, it must be for back-end developers, and that's indeed the case. As a back-end developer, when I start building a new application and I have these 3 components and I'm the back-end developer, I'm using a relational database like Postgres or MySQL, I have several kind of choices for how I want to interact with this database in terms of abstraction level. The lowest level of abstraction would be to just send plain SQL strings that I can write inside of my JavaScript code. I just write a SQL string and I submit that to the database and I receive a response back. That's totally possible, but it has several flaws or drawbacks. So first, you actually have to really know what you're doing in terms of using SQL, because SQL, I think, is one of the oldest technologies that we're using these days that is still kind of state of the art in the industry. SQL has been developed in the 60s or 70s, and it has been around for that long. And we're still using it. It's still the default for building applications. So it's still a great technology, but it's also really powerful and really complex and makes it very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. So usually you want to use higher level abstractions that are more developer friendly and let you reach your goals as a developer faster. Another problem just with the fact that we're writing SQL strings inside of our application means that a string is not type checked at all. We don't get any syntax highlighting or auto-completion, or for that matter, any red squiggly lines underneath when we're making a typo. So it's also very easy to accidentally introduce any typos or other kinds of mistakes inside of your SQL queries that might blow up the entire application. So really working on the lowest level of SQL, I think I've seen only very, very few teams who actually do this. And typically these are the teams that are staffed with very experienced SQL engineers. And I think that's also the only kind of situation where it's reasonable to choose that approach and not choose a higher level abstraction.
Got
it. Then the next level of abstraction is what we call SQL query builders. In the Node.js ecosystem, there is a popular one that's called KNextJS. And that's basically just a way to compose a SQL string by calling functions. So a very standard SQL query that would just return all the records from a table that's called users is just select star from users. That's a pretty standard SQL string, SQL query that you could write. And if you're using a SQL query builder, then you don't write this as a string anymore, but you would call a function that's called select. And then as an argument to that function, you would pass the name of the table. So you would call .select and then from users. And so it's already a little bit nicer because we're calling a function and then this actual string is composed for me under the hood. I don't have to type the string anymore inside of my code, but it's still very error prone, and it also actually still requires quite a high level knowledge of SQL if you follow that approach. And now we're going to the highest level of abstraction to so-called ORMs, object relational mappers. And when we're talking about object relational mappers, the reason why they're called like this is because they map the data structures between the relational database and the object-oriented programming language that we're using. And the difference is that inside of our object-oriented programming language, we may have objects that are nested. So nested structures inside of our application. And inside of a database, inside of a relational database at least, you cannot have nested structures. There you have a so-called flat or normalized data model where the data is organized in tables. And when you want to represent any kind of relations between your entities, between your data, then what you have to do is you have to reference the tables with each other with so-called foreign keys. Whereas, again, in our object-oriented programming language, when we want to represent related data, we just use nesting. We can just nest our objects deeply inside of each other. And that mapping, that has to happen somewhere, and that's what's happening inside of the ORM. And that's the problem that Prisma solves. It makes it easier for primarily backend developers, but also to front-end developers, thanks to framework like Next.js, where you can write server-side code as well. But primarily backend developers makes their lives easier by giving them a nicer abstraction to work with a database instead of using SQL.
I'm letting this sink in. I'm letting it sink in. And Anthony, are you talking about TweetyTag? Because that he's seen it. There's a PR chilling in there of how to probably fix it. And this is how he came on. Nicholas joined the show. Is he has seen TweetyTag and looked at all of this because, and I just want to throw this out there. It was actually Laura, who is on Mondays. We mostly talk about Python, and we were talking about like how to get questions answered. And I did not realize that Prisma had a Slack channel. So I hit up Prisma and was like, y'all, I'm stuck. Please help. And yeah, so it was pretty good.
Yeah, we'll look at the TweetyTag in a little bit, but let's maybe first familiarize yourself with the main workflows of Prisma that I mentioned before. And again, we are now working on the backend side. And the goal of working on a backend usually is to build some kind of API that's exposed to a front end later down the line so that the front end developers can get the data that they need when they're actually building the product. All right, how about you hit the big Get Started button in the top right corner, and we'll walk through the quick start together. And I will show you, or like I will provide you a couple of more in-depth explanations here as we go along than is provided in the quick start.
Yay!
All right, you don't have we can just use this. We can just use this guide here. You don't have to click on that link.
Okay.
There you go. This is the instructions to start with Prisma. So what we want to do now in this guide is we want to set up a local database. For that, we're going to use SQLite. Have you heard of SQLite before, or do you know how it's different from traditional databases like Postgres or MySQL?
No.
All right. SQLite is a super simple and straightforward relational database that just stores all its data inside of a single file with a .db suffix. And the reason why that's super simple compared to other databases is that with other databases, Postgres or MySQL, you actually have to install a piece of software on your computer in order to interact with that database. So you first would have to install Postgres now, or you're using Docker to spin up a Postgres instance, but you somehow need to get a database server running on your machine or on some kind of remote machine that you can then connect to. With SQLite, you can skip that step. And that's why we chose that for our quick start. It allows you to still persist data on the file system, but you don't need to have an extra piece of software running on your computer, and it just makes the entire process of getting to know Prisma a lot simpler as well. That's why we're using SQLite here.
I like Anthony's add-in for it too. It's like a regular SQL database, but way more doper.
Way more doper. I like that.
I like it. I like it. Okay. Cool. So
yeah, let's get started with these first commands. Let's create your project directory here. Nice. Yeah, if you just type that in, you created the directory and you navigated into it immediately. And the next step here is to initialize a node project. Have you seen this before, this npm init?
Yes, I
Mhm.
believe I ended up doing this at some point while trying to figure this out last week.
All right. What the npm init is for, it basically just creates the package JSON file that then lists all of your dependencies, right? The npm init, yeah, I don't think it does a lot more than just create the package JSON file. And
Okay.
then in the second step here, we had npm install TypeScript, TS Node, and the types from Node. So just a couple of more dependencies. Actually, these are all development dependencies that we don't need at runtime, that we only need at development time,
Okay.
to get TypeScript to work here in this context. And what we ultimately want to do here is we want to write a TypeScript script, so a little program that's just running from top to bottom, so no complicated server or anything, just a script that's running from top to bottom, and that will then read and write data in our SQLite database that we're going to use as well.
Got it.
All right, next we need a tsconfig file, and the touch tsconfig is the command for creating that. And at this point, you can actually already go maybe and open this directory inside of VS Code if that's possible. Oh, nice, you're using the code shortcut. I love this one.
Ta-da!
Perfect. So yes, the tsconfig JSON is already there. And it's empty, so you can now go ahead and copy the boilerplate from the quick start. It's really nothing special in there, just some default TypeScript configuration. All right. And at this point, I think actually from this point, I will guide you a little bit further instead of using the quick start.
Okay.
Now we have just a basic TypeScript project set up. And as a next step, we want to set up Prisma and the database. And then in the last step, we'll write the TypeScript program, the TypeScript script that will read and write data into the database.
Okay.
So to set up Prisma, you can install Prisma as a development dependency as well. And that's with the command npm install just Prisma, and then -D or --save-def to store it as a development dependency. If you just do dash and capital D now with a space, it will put this into your development dependencies. Have you seen this before? Like, are you aware of like the difference between a regular dependency and a development dependency?
I'm gonna go
if no, it's fine.
no.
Okay.
I don't know the difference.
So then, like maybe quickly hit enter, and then I'll explain the difference between the two. And to understand the difference, I think it's best to look at the package file, package.json in your side nav on the left. If you select that and you scroll a little bit, yes, or just make it bigger, you see that you have these def dependencies right there. And usually you have, so at the moment you have only the def dependencies, but usually you also have regular dependencies. And in fact, we'll install one in just a second. The regular dependencies that you don't see here yet are the ones that are being packaged with your application when you deploy it. So for example, when you deploy your application to Vercel, then it packages all the dependencies, the regular dependencies, into your application bundle, because these dependencies are needed in order to make your application work. The development dependencies, on the other hand, they are not needed for the application at runtime. So they aren't bundled into that application bundle that you're uploading to Vercel. Because you only need them at development time. For example, TypeScript is is not what is running inside of your web browser, right? It's only JavaScript. So TypeScript kind of gets removed from the application bundle when you deploy it. The same with Prisma here. The Prisma dependency is just the Prisma CLI. The Prisma CLI helps you with your workflows that you do during development, but it won't help you when you do or it's not useful for the application at runtime. Once the application has been deployed, the Prisma CLI has no use anymore. It's only useful for the developer as they build their application.
Really quick, just because I definitely, this is how my brain works, even though sometimes it can be very annoying, of like going, okay, cool. So we have like the dev dependencies, and there's 4 of them here. And then I'm looking at TweetyTag. So the one I get that we built it totally different, but it only has 1 dev dependency.
Well, now I think you're in the root folder of TweetyTag, if I remember the package structure correctly. If you go back, or if you go to the root, and now you click on the Next Forms app, you'll find another package.json in there. And there you'll find a whole lot more dependencies. And these are all the dependencies for your React app, for your next app. And that's actually also just like the one issue I saw with your repo, that you basically have 2 like separate projects in one repo at the moment. And I think that's our main task later, to kind of merge them into a single one.
Got it. And Anthony, thank you. That also really does help. I'm a what? I don't even know.
Mono repo is, I think, like a new trend at the moment to structure all of your applications inside of a single repo. So you're kind of the natural born mono repoist, because you put all of your apps just into a single repo.
Oh. I'm going to pretend that I totally get that. I don't. I was going to say thank you for this one, though. This is helpful to know. When we deployed the React app that I built with Anthony, React was a dependency, not a dev dependency. So yes, this is starting to make a little more sense.
Nice. All right, great. So now we have all the development dependencies set up, and now we can invoke the Prisma CLI that you just installed. And what we want to do is we want to create a Prisma schema file that we're going to use to define our database schema. And the command that you can do this with is called npx. You prefix it with npx, then Prisma, just like the dependency itself, exactly. And then the init command. And you can hit enter. That's enough already. And what this is going to do, it just creates a new directory on your file system that's called Prisma, and it creates this .n file. That's everything that this command did. So have you seen .n files before, or have you heard of the concept of environment variables?
All I know, and this is probably not enough about them, is they are in git ignores because you don't want them uploaded. And that is where you put your API keys and such. And that's basically all I know about them. I don't know what it stands for or anything, but
no problem. In that case, I would even say that we remove that additional layer of indirection. You can delete this .n file here, because for kind of teaching purposes, I think it's easier to just do it without. You can just go ahead and delete this file.
I will say, while I was building TweetyTag, I was okay showing all of that, because I was like, y'all, this is learning. Like, I'm not keeping anything secret in here right now. Like, I'll change it later on. It's fine.
Right.
So thank you.
So but the .n file is usually used to define your database URL. But in this case, I think we can do it directly inside of the Prisma schema. So if you look at this file, schema.prisma, it currently contains these 2 blocks, how we call them, a generator and a data source. The generator, really, you can ignore at this point. You don't really need to understand like what it's used for at this point. It just should suffice to say that it's responsible to generate Prisma client later on, and Prisma client is what's responsible to the component that lets you interact with your database, read data from it and write data into it. More important here is the data source. And that's where you specify the connection to a database. And this connection consists of 2 things. One is the provider, that means the kind of database that you're using, and the URL, that is where to find the database. With Postgres, the URL would have to point to a Postgres server. It's what I mentioned in the beginning, that with Postgres, with MySQL, you always need to have a server running, and then this URL would actually point to that server. In our case, since we want to use SQLite, you can first go ahead and adjust the provider from Postgres to SQLite. And you can do that also by using the auto completion. If you stop now, and if you hit Control Space on your keyboard, it shows you all the options that you can choose with this. And that, by the way, is one of the things that you should get used to when you're using Prisma, Control Space, because auto-completion is really a thing that we're optimizing for you to get as much progress as possible inside of your editor. And really, if you're completely blocked or stuck, we want you to go into the Prisma documentation to figure out more specifics about what you want to achieve.
Very cool.
So,
thank you.
Next, we need to set the database URL. And for that, because we're just specifying the location on our file system, you can type the following. So first, you can delete this entire env, including the env. You can delete everything there. Yeah. And now open new double quotes. And inside of these quotes, you type file : ./dev .db. DB, like database.
That makes more
exactly.
sense.
Yes. So what this means is that we want the SQLite database file to live on our file system in the current directory. That's what we specify with a /. We say that this is in our current directory. So inside of the Prisma directory, actually, where the schema.prisma file is also located. And the name of our database, we want to be dev.db. We could also call it hello.db. We could call it Jenn.db or users.db. But in this case, we just want to call it dev.db as our name.
Awesome. And we do have a question in here. So Homie's asking, Prisma does a great job creating a layer between the dev and SQL. With that in mind, briefly, what are some of the reasons they should reach out for MySQL versus Postgres? See if I can talk. They have worked with Postgres so far and are becoming comfortable. Are there reasons that they should look at other SQL database types?
That's a really good question. It basically comes down to what database should I pick for my application, and there are a lot of different trade-offs. Although I will say that for the majority of applications, it probably won't make a big difference whether you use Postgres or you use MySQL or even SQL Server. These have, if you look closer, all of these have different kinds of characteristics here and there, different kinds of trade-offs. Postgres, for example, has a rich extension system, a great way to work then with like geolocation data via extensions, for example. So Postgres, from what I've heard, is a very solid choice. And if you already are familiar with Postgres and you don't have a very application-specific reason to switch to another database for maybe specific performance reasons or something like this, I think just using Postgres as kind of the default is totally fine.
Got it. Thank you.
And we also have, by the way, in the Prisma Data Guide, which is a resource that we're maintaining with all kinds of information just about databases in general, we do have an article that compares all the different database types. So I just dropped this in our internal chat here, in our private chat in StreamYard, Jenn, and you can share this maybe in the public chat so that others can find it.
Just to show what it looks like real quick, and here we go. Oh, this is great. I definitely will want to look at this as well.
Yes, it's a very kind of thorough introduction to the topic of databases in general. And it's not Prisma specific. The entire Prisma the entire Prisma data guide, it carries our name, but it's really a very generic resource that doesn't talk about Prisma specifically, but just teaching database concepts.
I like what Anthony said of, for example, I used MySQL because I had a personal score to settle, which it is. It's just because that's what GoDaddy used. And I would have to like talk about it. And I still, to this day, I'm like, I just want to understand databases because I'm like, why, like with WordPress and so much of it, I've been tech adjacent for so long. Now that I'm learning, I'm like, I'm just going to figure them out. It's going to be great.
All right. Then we have the Prisma schema in place. We defined our database connection. So the next thing that you'll have to do is you'll need to write a model. And the models is what we use to define the structure of our database. So usually when you're working with a SQL database, you now would have to write some SQL code to even create tables inside of the database, and so that you can then later store data inside of the tables. So you first need tables, and then you can fill these tables with records. In our SQLite database, we have nothing. In fact, we don't even have the SQLite database file yet. We don't see the dev.db file inside of your inside of the Prisma directory yet, right? So you don't have to create it manually. I see that. I think you,
okay.
wanted to do that, but actually Prisma will create that file for you when you run your first migration. So that would be the workflow. If you didn't use Prisma, you actually indeed now would have to manually create the dev.db file, and then you would have to find some way to send the instructions to the database to create some tables so that you can then store data. With Prisma, you just define the structure of your database right here inside the Prisma schema, and then you can run the Prisma CLI commands to put the structures in the database in place to sync up the structure of your Prisma schema with the structure inside of the database. And yes, at this point, I would say you can copy the two models here and just paste them in.
I will say I want to give a shout out to Homie. Homie had to come on the stream with me for a little bit to start understanding these models because it was not sinking in. And that's why I like got excited. I was like, I know they go in here and I know what they do a bit better now. So yes, thank you, Homie. And thank you for the graphic today. It was a great graphic. And
okay,
yes.
so in the spirit of making this a little bit like educational, I'm just interested kind of in how would you describe the Prisma schema after my explanations, kind of in your own words, like what these models are for and what your current understanding now is of like where we are in the workflow in terms of the database and all that.
I would say just on what we've done so far, the ones that actually don't make as much sense, but I don't think I focused as much on is the package.json or tsconfig.json. Like those were new to me, or if I did them, I don't remember it. The explanation of the data source, that made a lot of sense to me. That's what I connected to Ivan. And it was cool to hear more about SQLite. I didn't know that was a thing. So yay. The generator client actually makes more sense now because of, let's see if I can go back to it. Because of this. Because I'm like, oh, that's the generator client, at least in my head, is that it translated. So it's what the generator that translate between the two. So that made a lot more sense. And then the models are basically what is the information you want about something or someone. So for the TweetyTag app, it was like, I want to, and this is where I really, really appreciate Homie like having me write it out, because I was not getting, it just wasn't clicking. And so by putting it in a Miro board, which sounds a little weird to do for a database, but I'm loading it up right now. Come over here. It helped me like understand, go away, please. What I would want to have as models of like a Twitter handle. I don't need more than a Twitter handle in one model. Like I don't want their first name. I just want their Twitter handle. And like I would want maybe the Twitter space may have the Twitter space link and the Twitter space name as one model. So it really helped like conceptualize it, putting it all on here. And look, Prisma's there. Yay.
Very nice.
So it definitely, that's how I would explain it, because then once this was done, I could use index. Wait, no, I'm skipping a step. The part that I'm skipping to in just like memory is after all of this when it calls it. So yeah. Okay. I don't remember all the stuff between it. That's cool.
All right. But I think that was a great explanation, especially like with the models, that the models represent the information that we need to store inside of the database to make the application work, basically. But again, at this point, inside of your editor, you only have defined these models, but we don't have a database yet. And we also don't have the tables yet. So that's what we'll do in the next step. We'll run a Prisma command in the terminal to sync the Prisma schema with the database schema and make sure that the database has the same structure as we defined in the Prisma schema file. And the command that you can run for this is called npx. Again, that's the prefix. And then Prisma, and the next word is migrate. And the actual command now is called dev, D-E-V again. npx prisma migrate dev. So what this is going to do is going to read the Prisma schema, and it now asks for a name that you should give this. I think you didn't save the Prisma schema file, and it complains that there are no models inside of it right now. If you save it and rerun the command, then it should ask you for a name for the migration. You can just call it init at this point, because it's the first one that we're running. We're initializing the database. You can hit enter. And you see that some things have happened here. Actually, let's look at the terminal output and understand piece by piece what has happened. If you scroll up again to where you ran the command, there you go.
And as everyone will probably tell you that watch the stream a lot, I like to click things too fast. I get really excited and I hit enter or I click it. So that is...
well, so far you had the perfect pace in terms of hitting enter.
Okay.
So first it loaded the Prisma schema from its location on the file system. It read the file system, and then it understood, okay, there should be a SQLite database file called devdb. And then it created that file. So on the left inside of your side nav in the file system, you already see that there is one that's called dev.db now. And you can ignore the one with dash journal in the end. That's just like a helper like SQLite file, but you can ignore that. So we have dev.db. That's our database. And at this point, we also already created two tables inside of the database, because the command that you just executed not only created the database files, but also the two tables that we defined inside of the Prisma schema. So if you now want to know what these tables look like, or what the SQL code looks like that you would have to write when you don't use Prisma, you can indeed open up the migrations folder there.
Oh, not Node. I don't want Node.
And this one as well, that's the folder for the migration that you just created. It is named with a timestamp at first. So that's what all of these numbers are. And then you see _init. And init is just the name of the migration that you provided. And that's the SQL code that was auto-generated by Prisma and that was already sent to the database as well. So inside of dev.db, you already have these tables now, but both of them are empty. You can actually validate that they're empty in a tool that's called Prisma Studio that comes with every Prisma project. That's a web UI to inspect the data inside of your database. And you can open that by running npx Prisma Studio inside of your terminal.
Sorry, my dog just scared the bananas out of me. Just saying. That is, she's a wild old lady. That is what my dog is. What was the command again? Sorry.
It's npx Prisma Studio.
npx.
This will open a browser window.
Ooh. Whoa. Okay, I definitely wasn't doing this.
With your Prisma models, and you can select post and user. And
whoa.
Yeah, if you zoom out, if you hit Command plus, I think it's zooming in a bit more convenient way, yeah, because it keeps the entire screen, or UI at least. Yeah, so here you could already start creating records for users and posts now if you wanted to. So you could click the Add Record button on top, or actually, yeah, let's maybe add a user, not a post, because here you have to provide, I think, an author ID. If you just hit discard changes, yeah, and then you click on the plus on top, and then you can select user, and now you're on the user table, and then you can add a record, and you can add, the ID you don't have to add, just an email. That's the only field that's required. You can add anything. You don't have to add. It won't validate like the structure of an email. And now you can either enter a name or just hit like save when change.
There. Yay. Save.
All right. I think this. So that's the long outstanding UX bug in Prisma Studio that already got, I think, Jason Langsdorff on our stream when I did the same with him 1.5 years ago. In Prisma Studio, when you type something into a field, you have and it's still selected, and you click like save changes, then it actually won't change. You have to click outside of that field once. So yeah, you can add Jenn again and click somewhere else, and now you can hit save one change, and then it'll process. Yeah, that's like, I've reported it back then. It still hasn't been picked up, but it's one of the things that you have to be aware of when getting started with Prisma Studio.
Gosh, Anthony.
Me too, Anthony. I don't understand what our product and engineering teams are doing all day.
Jason is actually going to be on the show later this month, and I'm pretty excited about that too.
Nice. All right. Yeah, I had a huge or just like a very, very fun time when I was on his stream.
Yay!
Cool. So now, Jenn, we have a database in place, and we already stored one record inside of the user table. So now starts the fun part, and that's where we will read and write data in the database from the TypeScript program that we want to write, from a TypeScript script. And that's, by the way, the only reason why we needed the tsconfig file, because we want to use TypeScript, and we just set some specific configurations for using TypeScript, but otherwise you can ignore that file. All right, you can hit Control-C, I guess, to stop Prisma Studio inside of your terminal. Yeah, kill that process. And now we need a file that's called script.ts, and you can just execute a command that's called touch to create this file, and then script.ts will be the name of the file as the next word. Yes, script.ts. Could also be called hello.ts or demo.ts, app.ts, index.ts. We just call it script here. And yeah, it should have been created on your file system. So in your file tree on the left, you should be able to find it. And if you open it, you'll see that it's empty. Yeah, so now you can quickly head back to the quick start and copy the boilerplate for that script.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit further down, a little bit. There you go. That's the boilerplate. So a TypeScript script is just a file that gets executed from top to bottom. And if you scroll up, what this basically does at the moment, it imports Prisma client. That's the component that we'll use to interact with the database to send queries to read and write data. The next line is const Prisma equals new Prisma client. That's where we instantiate Prisma client. That's where we actually create the physical instance inside of our application that lets us do this, that lets us interact with the database. The next one is a main function. We need this because we want to use the await keyword. So we need an async function here where we can do this to resolve the promises of our database queries. And then in the end, we just call the main function so that it gets executed and have some additional boilerplate code that you also don't need to really worry about.
I'm not sure if this is just the way I was trying to do things or not, but when I was trying to do like a read query and a write query separately, they wouldn't do them separately unless I had the index file, which we don't have an index file here. We have script.ts, but not sure. Like if I had the index file and I wanted to read it, I could, or if I wanted to write it, I could. But without the index file, the read and write wouldn't work.
Interesting. I think that's like if it came down to what it was named, it probably was relevant in the context of the Next.js app or the framework that you were using, because these frameworks have conventions for how files should be named. In this case, we're not using a framework. We're just using plain TypeScript. So we can really name the file whatever we want. It's not yet in the context of any framework, so we don't have to call it index.ts. We don't need to signal to the framework through the name of our file what the purpose of the file is.
Got it. Thank you.
So yeah, you can already run this file, by the way. If you execute the command npm run dev. It's actually not the command, sorry. It's actually npx, because we're using plain ts node here, and then npx ts-node. And now the name of the file, script.ts. So this just executes your TypeScript script from top to bottom, but there is nothing in there that we would see in the console at the moment because we don't have any console log statements. So it just executes all of these lines of code here that you see, importing Prisma, instantiating Prisma client, executing an empty main function, but nothing really happens. So how about you just, like, for our own understanding, put a console log statement even before the definition of the main function. Yeah, and just like put one there, and you can just write something like hello, or we haven't executed the main function yet, or something like this.
I don't even remember how to do a console log. It's been so long.
That is console.log.
Okay. And
now you open parentheses, and then you can put in a string. If you hit escape. Escape should, yeah, hello.
But I put on all of them. Yay. Okay.
Yes. So if you save it and in the terminal run the same command again, then it will print this, because we're just executing this script file from top to bottom. Okay?
Got it. Okay.
All right, so now comes the interesting part, and that's where we're going to explore the Prisma client querying API to send queries to the database. And when I use the term API here in the context of Prisma client, it's important to distinguish it from, or to disambiguate it from the term API that we have talked about before already when we were talking about a web API that's consumed by a front end. The term API is very ambiguous. It only means application programming interface. And that can literally be anything that allows you to interact with any kind of piece of software. And if we're talking about APIs in the context of web applications, we often call them web APIs or HTTP APIs or REST APIs or GraphQL APIs. These are the ways how a client, a front end, mobile application, browser application will fetch data from the server via the HTTP API. When I talk about the Prisma Client API, what I mean is the functions and methods that Prisma Client exposes to send queries to the database. So in this case, it's more of a database API that lets me talk to a database. But that's the term API when I use it as Prisma Client API.
Okay.
And the Prisma Client API, we're going to explore inside of the main function. And I would say that we're starting by trying to read the record from the user table that you just created inside of Prisma Studio. So you can delete this comment inside of the main function. And let's write our first Prisma Client query here. And we are storing the results of the query inside of a constant that we want to call users. So what you can write is const users. Const, that's, yeah, and then users equals. And now you can use the await keyword, await. And now you can type Prisma as the next word. And now you say dot. And again, here's the cool part about Prisma, the autocompletion. So now you don't have to type a lot anymore. You basically only have to know when you have to open braces and parentheses. But otherwise, you can let yourself be guided through the experience of composing a Prisma client query using the autocompletion. And in this case, we want to retrieve all of the users that are currently stored inside of the database. So you can go prisma.user. And if you put another dot, you will have another palette of suggestions. And in this case, we want to use the find many query because that just fetches all of the users that are currently inside of the database. And maybe to just adhere to the like TypeScript conventions, you can indent this line with one tab. So yes, perfect. And behind find many, you also have to open and close parentheses because we're calling a function here. Find many is a function. And whenever we call a function, we have to use parentheses. All right. This line itself already is going to execute a database query against the SQLite database file that you have on your file system here, the devdb, and it will retrieve all the user records and store it inside of the variable called, inside of the constant called users. So if you execute this, you can do this, npx node, exactly. The output in the terminal still won't change because while this code is being executed, we don't do anything with the users to actually show them on the console. So what you can do next, you can insert a new console.log statement in the next line after const users, immediately after const users, not after the brace. Yeah, exactly, in that line. And you can say console.log. And this time inside of the parentheses, you just put users. So again, and inside of parentheses. So after console.log, you have to open parentheses.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Give me just stop highlighting it.
Yeah, these, that's indeed annoying about VS Code. All right, so if you execute this again, then you'll actually see the database entry now logged to the console.
Interesting.
All right, how about we quickly look at what Prisma is actually doing under the hood to just put some pieces together in your head, maybe.
Yeah.
If you scroll up in the file to line 3, where we instantiate Prisma Client, and inside of the parentheses there, after new Prisma Client, the empty parentheses, if you put in curly braces there and hit enter once, and now you hit control space again, you'll see some options that you can use to configure Prisma client. And in this case, we want to use the log option. So you can say log here. Now a colon. And then you can open square brackets. And inside of the square brackets, you can start or open quotes, double quotes or single quotes, doesn't matter. And there you see the different things that you can ask Prisma Client to log for you under the hood. And if you select query here, it will log the SQL queries that are being executed against the database under the hood by your Prisma Client instance. So yes, if you save the file and run it again, you now not only see the output in JSON format, but we actually see the Prisma client, the SQL query that is generated based on the TypeScript query that you've created there. Select user. So it specifies all the individual fields, the user.id field, the user.email field, the user.name field from the user table, and then just like some more cryptic stuff because this is auto-generated SQL code. So in a plain or more simple form, you could also write this query as select star from users, and it would have the same effect basically. It gives you all of the tables.
Interesting. Fakoi, what it does limit mean and where are the params in the query?
We are using, okay, this gets a little bit more into the weeds. I'll just give a couple of short hints here. The params for the SQL query are passed separately because we're using prepared statements with Prisma. Prepared statements are a concept in SQL where you can already define SQL snippets, you store them on the database server, and then just pass the parameters like separately. That's why we don't see any parameters here. And also the limit and offset, these are keywords to specify pagination, which in this case we're also not using. And yeah, this SQL query here could be like very much simplified, but because it's auto-generated, it looks a little bit more cryptic sometimes or includes information that's not always needed at this particular point. All right, how about we create another record in the database? And this time I would say that we're creating a post record, and we are going to do this in code now, Jen, not in Prisma Studio, but in code.
Okay.
So what you can do inside of the main function again, and I would say we do this even before, before the current line. So you can go ahead and write const. Again, we will store the result of this operation in a variable or inside of a constant. And let's just call it post. It's going to be a single post object equals await Prisma. This time we want to create a post, not a user. So you can select post here in the auto completion. And if you hit dot again, this time we don't want to retrieve or read a post, but we want to create one. And there is a method or function that's called exactly that. Now you have to open parentheses again because it's a function that we want to call. And inside of there, we now have to provide some arguments. So at this point, if I'm not mistaken, TypeScript will actually yell at you because you say, or like you're telling TypeScript that you want to create a post record in the database. But if you look back at the schema.prisma file, actually, if you quickly open that, it's a good opportunity to talk about some of the concepts in here and scroll to the post model. Like, how do you understand the different fields of that post model? Maybe you can explain to me what you can read and understand from these field definitions here. So how many fields first are there on this post model?
Would it be, I'm not sure if it would be 5 or 6. I say that because the ID is like auto created, but it's still something that's it created, so it could be 6,
It,
but the
yeah,
title. Oh, go ahead.
we do have 6 fields indeed on this post model. The
Okay.
ID does count as a field. And so does the author field, which is of type user. But
Okay.
that's a special field, actually, because that's a relation field. It denotes a relation to another model. And all of
Okay.
the others are so-called scalar types or primitive types that are stored directly in the database. So we have 6 fields here, indeed. And each field has a name, it has a type, and it has potentially some attributes. And it also potentially has a type modifier. Now, what's a type modifier and what's it used for? Inside of the, or in the fields of the post model here, we only have one type modifier, and that's the question mark after the string on the content field, indeed. Can you imagine what this question mark means semantically in the context of what we're doing, or have any idea? It can be a wild guess.
This actually got me kind of stuck when I was trying to make the models myself. I wasn't sure if like the title was something, because the title has the string by itself, if then content has the string because they can't be the same type of string. They have to be 2 different strings to be read by the database.
That goes into the right direction already, but I think this would rather be a unique attribute, how you could prevent 2 titles from being exactly the same, or from preventing 2 posts to have exactly the same. Actually, if you scroll up to the user model, there is a unique attribute on the email field here. And
unique.
And that guarantees that the database will not allow that you ever create 2 users with the same email. So the database is going to prevent that if you are using the @unique attribute here. The type modifier, the question mark, is slightly different. It is used to indicate to the database which columns need to have a value when you create a record. For example, when you created the user record, remember how you had to put in an email, but you didn't have to put in a name. That's because inside of the Prisma schema here, the email is marked as required because it doesn't have the question mark at the end. When a field inside of the Prisma schema has no question mark in the end, it means it's required inside of the database. The database will ensure that whenever you create a new record, that there is a value for that particular column in that record. You can never have a database record in the user table that has no email because it's required.
Got it.
The name is optional. That's why we put the string here. The same with the post model. All of the properties, all of the fields on the post model are required except for the content. So when you create a new post, you don't have to submit information for the content, but you have to submit values for everything else. Actually, that's not quite true, because the published field, as you see there, right below content, has the default attribute. So because the value in the database is still required, but if you don't provide one yourself when creating a new post record, the database will provide it for you and will just set it to false as specified here.
Would it only do this as a Boolean, or could it do like a string default?
It can also do a default string. It can do a default integer and default, for pretty much any other type except for relation fields. There you can specify a default.
Oh, this is fun. Okay.
Yes. All right. So if we go back into the script file now, so we have seen now that you at least need to provide a title and an author ID, because these are the 2 fields on the post model that are required and that don't have a default value assigned to them. So it's understandable that TypeScript is now yelling at you and like showing these red squiggly lines because you're trying to create a new post record inside of the database. but you don't provide the content and the title. And before you spell out the title here, you should open curly braces again, because you're passing the title and the author ID as an object here. So inside of this curly brace object, you can now hit Control Space. And it'll show you what you can submit here. And again, the title and the author information are wrapped inside of this data object. So yes, you need to select data here. And now colon and opening braces again. The curly ones, I'm sorry. Open curly braces and hit enter. And now Control Space again. And now you can actually select the properties that you have to submit. So title, hello world, or anything you like.
Because it would have to be within strings, right? Or no?
Yes, it has to be submitted as a string. That's correct. Nice. So TypeScript is still complaining. So first you have to add a comma after the title line at the end. And now in the next line, if you hit Control Space again.
Yeah. I'm going to do it that way. There we go. Control Space.
All right. You now have two different ways how you can connect an existing user record to this post that you're about to create. Either via the author field or the author ID field. If you do it via the author ID field, you have to know the ID of the user record that you want to connect it to. You can use this here actually, because I know what the ID is. It's just 1, because you only created a single one and it's auto incrementing. So the only the only user record that you can even connect it to is the author with ID 1. And you see the TypeScript error went away, because now we specified a title and an author ID. So the only two required fields that didn't have a default value are now provided with values. So what you can do now is you can save the file and run the query, and run the script again. And maybe we remove the log now, because now it's just going to clutter the console log statements. So up in the Prisma client constructor, yes, and the log option inside of Prisma client, you can just like put a comment there as well. Yes, and if you save the file and run it again, we will only see the output of the user find many query, because we are actually not logging anything else. If you hit Command K in your terminal, by the way, you can clear it, and it's and if you run the script a couple of more times, you'll see that it never will make a difference. We don't see anything, but with every time that you execute the script, the Prisma.create, the Prisma.post.create query will be executed, and every time you're creating the same post record all over again in the database. Let's quickly validate this in Prisma Studio. If you run npx Prisma Studio again, and you open the post table inside there.
Oh, cool.
You see that several of these posts have been created, and they all belong to this one user that you created before. So if you go to the user table inside of Prisma Studio here, and you click on post, the 4 posts there, you actually can see the relation between the two. But so it's because the user with ID 1. So if you close this relation view again, so the user has ID 1, right? And in your code, when you specified the author ID for all the new posts that you're creating, you specified author ID 1, right? And that's how you connected the two.
That makes sense. But if I wanted to, if I had a lot more in there and I just knew the title, could I query it without the title? Or without the number? if I didn't know
Yes, you
anything
can.
else?
Of course, querying, yes, but here you're creating it, right?
Okay.
I think we can distinguish a create query from an update query, from a delete query, from a read, like find many
Right.
query or find unique. And each of these will have different kinds of values that you have to put in first to tell Prisma what exactly you're looking for or what you want to do. And when you create, then of course you don't need, then you have to provide the value of the author that you want to connect it to. Or alternatively, actually, we can go the alternative path. If you delete the author ID line there, just the author ID.
Author ID, yeah.
And instead, we're now using author. So if you go in author, colon, braces, enter, colon, curly braces, enter, colon, braces, enter, and control space for auto completion. Connect, because we want to connect this new post record to an existing user record. Again, colon, curly braces, enter. And again, control space. And now you can decide how do you want to connect it, either by ID, that's what you already did. But here you can also choose the email, because the email is specified as unique inside of the Prisma schema. So Prisma knows that there can only be one user with a particular email. And indeed, if you now choose the email that you've used before for this one user record and you run the script again, you could also start Prisma Studio in a separate tab, by the way. Or now just if you click on the plus inside of the local VS Code. So now it has 5 posts. You see that it's still connected it to this one user, this time by the email. If you type in, by the way, an email that doesn't exist, you can try that. Yeah. So if you just have a typo in there or an empty string or, yes. And you run npx tsnode to run the script.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
You can still leave this running and just hit the plus on top of the terminal there, and that open. Yeah, no, further down. You had it.
Thank you.
The plus. You open a second terminal.
Okay.
And you can hit npx tsnode script.ts.
Is it dash tsnode?
Dash tsnode, yes.
Script. I feel like I typed this wrong, but
I think it should work. So now, did you save the script.ts file?
I thought so, but why are you not saving? Okay, save.
All right, can you run it again?
Oh, okay.
Now it runs into an error because no user record was found for the nested connect one-to-many. But like fundamentally, the issue here is, I think if you scroll up, maybe you also have a bit more. No record was found or something. An operation failed because it depends on one or more records that were required but not found, right? A post needs an author, but you provided invalid information for the author that you wanted to connect this new post to. So it didn't work. But we still don't see the posts of the user record printed here, and that's because Prisma by default it only prints all the scalar fields of the models of the objects that it sends queries for. So in this case, ID, email, and name are all scalar fields, but the post relation field is not included. However, you can include that, and we'll do that next inside of the Prisma client query, the find many query actually that we have, prisma.user.findMany. bit further down. Yeah, a bit further up inside of the main function.
Oh,
Yes,
there we go.
Prisma.user.findMany. In there, you can open curly braces.
Within find many or
Yes,
outside?
it's within the parentheses and control space. Now you have there include, and that allows you to include relation fields in the same query when you're reading data. So colon, braces, enter, control space. And this now shows you the options that you can include inside of the query result. And in this case, we want to include the posts. So you can click on posts and then it's colon and true. You can just write true here. It tells Prisma that you also want to include all of the posts of each user record that you're fetching from the database. So if you run this again, npx tsnode script, the output will change and it will now include the posts key here, but it doesn't render the posts properly because that's how console.log works. What you can do is you can switch it to console.dir, dir.
Oh, down here.
And no, inside of your code where you currently have console.log users, after the prisma.user.findMany query, bit further down, yes. And you can switch that to console.dir, dir, and then after users, inside of the parentheses, you put a comma, curly brace, and then curly braces. Yeah, and now you type depth, colon, and then just the number 0. All right, if you save this and run it again, and yeah, maybe make a bit more space for the terminal. Now it just renders a single object. Actually, sorry. Instead of 0, it's null, not 0, but actually null. Yes. And now if you run it again, now you should see the nested object. So that's, by the way, what I initially referred to as nested objects. If you make even more space for the terminal, if you scroll up, we have a lot of posts for this particular user already. But if you scroll up to the beginning of where you ran the query, you see that all of these posts are actually nested inside of a user object, right? On the root level inside of this object, you have the fields of the user. So again, if you scroll up a little bit to the user, the entire object starts with the scalar fields of the user, ID, email, and name. But then you also include inside of the same object, you're nesting more objects, and this time inside of an array. So posts has an array of more objects now. And that's what I refer to as nested objects in the beginning. Because in the database, you recall that these are not stored physically together. They are stored in separate tables. And the only way how an application can now know which record is associated with which record in the other table is by following the reference from the foreign key, the author ID. But here inside of our JavaScript code, we now have them physically co-located inside of the same object. So that's kind of the different paradigm between relational databases and object-oriented programming language, where we can have nested data, whereas the flat and normalized tables always have references to each other.
What you're saying makes sense. I feel like I'm definitely going to need to mess with this more. And I cannot believe that it's already been over an hour and a half.
Oof. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that went super fast.
On that note, I am going to save this and I'll get it uploaded to my create a repo for it, because I feel like this is probably a good pausing point. And
Yes.
I absolutely love this because there are a lot of steps that I didn't do, and I don't know if it was on on the walkthroughs or what, or I was just super enjoying it. Anthony says that Prisma is quite the rabbit hole. They've been tumbling down it for 3 years now. Of course you would send this my way, Anthony. Of course you would. I am totally sidetracking to see if I can find someone to raid to that look cool. So hopefully Coding Garden looks cool. It looks like they're doing cool things right now. And any questions that y'all have before we raid out? Oh, yes. Yes, I agree with this. Now that I know what I was trying to do, yeah, like this would be way harder if I wasn't using Prisma. 100% agree with this, Anthony.
All right.
Anything that you think we should have been asking?
I think we went through all the main workflows. We looked at data modeling. We looked at the migrations, how you apply the data model to your database, and also at some queries. So yeah, the next step is for anybody to try it out themselves and integrate it in their applications. And yeah, if you like want to follow up about the PR or about your Next.js app, if you have further questions there, if things don't work, then feel free to ping me again on Twitter, Jen.
Or we're all just going to try to convince you to come on the show again sometime.
I can also do that. I will be very happy to do a follow-up now that we have the basics out of the way.
This was very, very cool. And thank you, and agreed with everyone. This was great. Thank you for being on the show today. And I'm going to get y'all rated. And thank you, everyone, for joining today and asking great questions. This was definitely, oh goodness, not the way I went about building my Prisma stuff. So it is always good to have that. So thank you again, and goodbye, everyone. See you Thursday.